speaker for this morning, Vineet, and we've been discussing for months about getting you to speak to our members and the conference delegates. So I'm really pleased we finally got you, and thanks for accommodating changes in times and the early morning over there in Mumbai. But Vineet is a real pioneer in the impact investing space, working as a founder and chairman of the Avishkar Group, which is really an impact investing platform that you'll hear a lot more about over the next 15 minutes in the sort of venture capital end of the spectrum there, and really focusing on working on presenting opportunities for the emerging 3 billion as the Avishkar Group talks about it. So I'm really pleased to have Vineet here today to challenge us, to make us think really about how we actually get capital flowing to the right people and the right communities to really create the positive impact in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. So with that, Vineet, welcome, and I'll hand over to you to take over. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Simon, and a namaskar or a namaste to everyone. And I am pleased, honored, and thankful for having me here. In an ideal world, I would have loved to come to Australia to meet you all in person. But given the circumstances which we are in, I think I'm happy that I'm sitting here in Mumbai and actually doing a namaste to you. I have never had the opportunity to come to Australia, so it's the only continent I have not been to. And I was actually really looking forward to it. But let me try to make the best out of whatever the opportunity presents. My job is to talk about investments that will help SDGs. But if you look at my background, I'm a forester by training, so not necessarily the best guy to really talk about investments, not really qualified. But let me share my story, and then I'll actually come down to SDGs and how I see the challenges that impact investing has faced, and how COVID-19, probably with all its negativity, has a silver lining to offer to change the way the world's capital functions. So that's how I'm actually going to frame my talk. But let me start by introducing you to my whole story. As I said, I come from a classical middle-class Indian family, became a forestry manager, and then was living in a forest. Now, even if you have lived in India, and we actually have a significant amount of poverty, so if you were born and brought up in a small city in India, you're not necessarily not used to seeing poor people. But when I went to the forest, I actually came across this very proud but very poor people who would rather starve than to actually beg. And I was quite intrigued because I was 21, 22-year-old. I had seen all kinds of poverty, and I thought I knew quite a lot about poverty. But this kind of poverty was quite unique. And so as a curious young man, I went and asked people, how do you think? What do you think? And I was very surprised. The poor were exactly like me. They were not very different. They had the same aspirations that we had, or my parents had at that point of time for me. They had the same aspiration for their children. And funnily, every time I actually asked anyone as to what future do you seek? And the answer was quite uniform. They all wanted to be rich, and rich not as wealthy. I think a lot of people understand rich by having a lot of money, but the richness that they were seeking was having just what is basic necessities for you and me. 2 square meals a day for their children and themselves, a roof on their head, water, sanitation, and electricity, and an education that their children can access. I got married in 1997, and my wife convinced me to leave the forest. In my next avatar, I was actually setting up India's first rural incubator as a 26-year-old, and my job was to convert farmers' innovations into businesses. And again, I came across this very unique thought process that farmers were quite rich with innovations and ideas, but to convert those ideas and innovations into business, you needed a significant amount of risk capital, and you needed talent, and that was what was missing on the ground. How do you actually take capital to far-flung geographies and convert very bright ideas with large business scope into real businesses was a challenge. And how do you attract talent? Everybody wants to go to cities, not to villages. So I tried to convince my board, which was quite an influential board in the state of Gujarat on the west side of India, which is a reasonably rich state in India. And to my dismay, I found that my very bright ideas as a 29-year-old of taking capital and intellect to rural India was not found favor with my board. in a huff. And as if you are naive and young, it's very easy for you to do that. I actually quit my job. And with a large amount of capital, I had a personal saving of $100 and I felt very rich at that point of time. I launched a fund called Avishkar to take capital to rural India. And this is all 2001. At that point of time, venture capital itself was nascent in India. 2001, some of you would remember, was also a technology meltdown time. And here, a 29-year-old with no experience of investments, with a forestry background, was trying to raise probably one of the early impact funds in the world. My story was not a great story. I actually struggled, stumbled, fell many times over. And after 7 years, I actually managed to raise $14 million. And in the process, also made multiple investments. Most of them were failing or falling apart. I learned a very good lesson at that point of time. Good intentions does not necessarily lead to real impact. A lot of people will tell you good intentions are very important. Yes, I agree, they are very important. But let me assure you, good people trying to help good people does not necessarily make good business sense to make real impact. And that was my first learning in my life, 2007. Since then, I became smarter, wiser. My hair started graying, as you can see. And with wisdom seeking in, I also realized that equity per se is a limited instrument, but it is very, very important in the act of creation. It's very important if you are trying to create jobs where people live, if you are trying to actually make impact where people are and not trying to extract people from there. I also realized as I actually moved forward in my journey of discovering impact and making impact and creating impact, that debt has a very large role to play in case you want to scale. I was significantly involved in the movement of microfinance when it started unfolding in 2001 as the first investor in a large number of microfinance institutions. And in 2010, Avishkar Group, actually 2012, actually Avishkar Group added a microfinance operations business to its line. We call it Arohan, and it's roughly around $700 million now in our assets. But I also realized as I learned about social impact bonds, development impact bonds, that you need to build an entire ecosystem of capital if you really want to make impact. And as things started evolving and as we started seeing very different kind of businesses, I also learned that if you want to go to far-flung geographies, to difficult ecosystems, to broken ecosystems, technology is going to play increasingly critical role. And so therefore, if you are an impact investor who want to involve or engage into the act of creation of real impact, you want to go to far-flung broken ecosystems to make impact, you will have to look at the entire ecosystem financial capital, but you'll have to also understand and learn the technological innovations that are taking place. Finally, a very important thing that I learned during this period, and we have been actually a fairly significant player through Intellectual Capital or Intellecap, the company that I created, inspired by the idea of taking talent to rural India ecosystems, was that there is a need to build an ecosystem that bring every critical actor, not just the capital provider, not just the entrepreneur, but the governments. The governments are equally critical and important, and if they see you as a threat, remember that poor in a democracy are actually significant vote banks, and governments do not like if you seem to be actually making money out of the poor. We burned our fingers while dealing with microfinance, and we realized very quickly that you need to figure out a way to engage the governments so that you build an ecosystem that has trust and has some level of credibility with each other. I would actually say something which is quite counterintuitive to a lot of folks. I genuinely believe impact measurement is important, but creating impact is far more important. And this has actually been one of the challenges I've faced as impact investing has started maturing and started coming to mainstream. Let me try to now take you to sustainable development goals. And let's not go back to 2015. Let's try to close our eyes and go to 2030. So let me fast forward you to 2030. Let's close our eyes and imagine a world which has natural capital getting the same respect that the commercial capital has in the world's eyes today. Imagine a world where climate change is the topmost agenda for all the countries. Imagine a world where data is the only fuel. The oil economy is a passe. Extractive industries are not necessarily what they are driving the future of the economy. And if that's the kind of world we want to imagine and live, a world that is free of hunger, free of poverty, free of inequity, free of racial discrimination of any kind. That's the world that was imagined by 193 countries of the world coming together in 2015 when they signed up and said there is something called Sustainable Development Goals. And as I actually imagine what is it that we were thinking about the idea of impact investing, a powerful idea that we thought was conceived to challenge the hegemony of greed and desire to maximize returns at all costs by taming the capital into a more humane, sustainable, and inclusive tool for change. It was an idea that was supposed to push mainstream capital to adopt a new way of doing business where the interest of stakeholders that included people and planet was at par with the interest of shareholders. During its early days, the idea was seen as utopian and was marginalized as a fringe innovation. As more interestingly, it was seen as an alternate to philanthropy rather than a challenge to the hegemony of commercial capital and its single bottom line pursuit. Of course, over the last decade, things have changed. Today, with $500 billion allocated to impact investment, some of the largest aggregator of capital are now committed to this idea and see it as an important tool of change. I think it's a very proud moment for all of us that impact investing has come this far. And I think it has a very important role to play in sustainable development goals. Let's actually for a minute close our eyes and imagine what is the size of global capital pool. Roughly $300 trillion. Different studies put it at different numbers from $270 trillion to $370 trillion. The primary objective is this capital is to maximize returns for its shareholders. Better Business, Better World, a report that was published by the Business Commission on Sustainable Development, was chaired by Paul Polman, and I happened to be one of the commissioners who was contributed to that report. We realized that the total requirement to reach the SDG goals, and this was published in 2018, is roughly US $2.5 trillion a year. A very, very large sum. If you just look at all the donor capital of the world, roughly translates into 250 to 300 billion. So we had a 10% of capital dedicated towards SDG, but our needs were 90% of the capital, a very, very large amount. But if you look at it in the context of the global pool of capital, it seems like a very small amount. And therefore, I thought that $500 billion being pushed towards impact investing makes impact investing probably one of the most interesting tools in the world of sustainable development goals, realizing the idea of sustainable development goals through that investment. Believing that impact investing has this potential to disrupt the global economic order, I also realized that this is actually a very threatening concept to the established and deeply entrenched world order. It is a concept that probably is not going to make money comfortable. As a naive forester, I had learned over time that money does not like the idea of change. The money managers do not like things changing around them. And to my dismay, I started seeing that the managers of money co-opted the idea of impact investing by calling what we call as mainstreaming it. What is mainstreaming for impact investing? It is essentially in the guise of numbers and outcomes, rather than outcomes, actually outputs. Its soul was being seen to be replaced by what was already happening in the economy. Let's all agree that everything that we do makes some impact, positive. There are very few businesses which only have negative impact. And so I actually saw the idea of doing good to do well being replaced by doing good and doing well, separating the idea of impact from the process of capital allocation. This allows us, with minor tweaks in the current economic architecture, to continue to do what the capital world has done for ages and has been and yet to be seen impactful and sustainable. We were almost coming to an idea that was as good as it gets. You can have your cake and eat it too. And then came COVID. I actually saw the world really coming down to its knees with the decimation that we saw. But more importantly, what really, really impacted was 2 decades of progress in fighting poverty being wiped out. Just imagine 305 million people expected to lose their full-time job, 1.6 billion people who are part of the informal economy. And I can tell you in India, we see it with our own eyes, massively damaged to their livelihoods. The global extreme poverty rate could rise to 9% in 2020, and people living below US $5.5 a day could rise to 42% by 2022. 2 decades of hard work done fighting poverty just been wiped out. Our dream to actually make the world a better place by 2030 is moving away in a faster manner than it has been till now. COVID-19 is a pandemic and a health issue, yes, but along with it, it has also done something very interesting. It has democratized fear as it ruthlessly impacts everyone, including the rich and the powerful. With the wheel of the economies coming to a grinding halt, the manager of capital have seen decimation of wealth as never before. It's for the first time, it's not a question of return of capital. It is then return on capital. We are struggling to actually just return the capital itself. I think it is no more a dream that something wrong is going to happen. The dream, that pain, that painfulness of a pandemic, the damages that it can cause to an economy has walked into the boardrooms. And today we are faced with something which is very fearful. I believe C19 or COVID-19 as a disrupting force, we rewrite the economic thinking that will also influence capital allocation. I genuinely believe resilience with returns will be the economic response to this disruption. And this is what exactly we started impact investing with. It encourages the world of capital to embrace sustainable investing for good returns. It seeks capital to be invested in a way that uplifts people and society sustainably. And therefore, it is not about having just good intentions, and it is not about actually having measuring the outputs. It is having a process that allows the outcomes to be delivered in a certain way. So my prognosis is that 2030 is still possible and can be imagined, and we can have a reimagined world at our doorstep. If impact becomes the new mainstream, we are not looking at impact investing to be mainstreamed. We are making impact as the new mainstream. A new dawn that is not driven by the practitioners of impact, but driven by the providers of capital. In the new economic world order, the only thing that will matter is an inclusive and sustainable world. When that happens, capital companies and leaders will look to build business that further equity, inclusiveness, and sustainability as a core strategy and seek shareholders' return that draw from this. As I conclude, I would like to say the world has 7 billion people, but very few control the capital. And while 99.9% of the humanity may forget the trauma of the COVID-19 crisis few years down the line, the few who control global wealth, those with money and influence, are unlikely to forget the impact of this pandemic. The world will change not because people will remember the trauma of hunger and inequity. It will change because the virus has permeated the fear right inside the boardrooms of the largest companies and the family office of the richest people. The change will come as self-preservation for the rich because becomes a priority, and global shifts only take place when powerful are fearful. Thank you so much.